The tomb had been sealed for 1,400 years when the archaeologists finally broke through the entrance. Not looted, not disturbed by the construction crews who had been working in the area for months before the discovery was made, not touched by the centuries of human activity that had occurred on the surface above it. The farming, the building, the erosion, the slow transformation of the landscape that 14 centuries of human presence inevitably produces. The tomb had simply waited, sealed beneath the earth of central Mexico, its contents exactly as they had been placed on the day someone arranged the burial and closed the entrance and walked away, and the knowledge of what lay beneath the particular piece of ground began its long process of being forgotten by everyone except the earth itself. What the archaeologists found when they opened it shook the historical understanding of pre-Columbian Mexico in ways that the academic community is still fully processing. Not because the tomb contained gold, although some of what it contained was extraordinary in its material value. Not because the burial was elaborate, although the elaborateness of what had been placed in the tomb with the deceased spoke to a level of ritual, sophistication, and social complexity that revised existing timelines of cultural development in the region. What shook the historical understanding was the specific combination of what was found: the objects, the skeletal remains, the spatial arrangement of the burial goods, the symbolic language encoded in the tomb's construction and contents, and what that combination implied about who was buried there, what society had produced them, and how that society connected to the broader sweep of Mesoamerican civilization in ways that existing models had not adequately accounted for. The discovery was not the result of a targeted excavation conducted by researchers who had reason to believe a significant tomb existed at that location. It was the result of the particular combination of chance and systematic response that has produced many of the most significant archaeological finds in Mexican history. Infrastructure construction, the expansion of a road system in the state of Oaxaca, brought heavy equipment into an area that Surface Survey had not identified as a high-priority archaeological site. The construction crew struck something that was not soil. The work stopped. The archaeologists arrived. And what began as a routine salvage excavation, the standard procedure when construction in Mexico encounters potentially significant archaeological material, became something that nobody who was present in those first days of careful excavation had anticipated. The tomb is associated with the Zapotec civilization, one of the earliest and most sophisticated of Mesoamerican cultures, whose heartland was the valley of Oaxaca and whose greatest expression was the city of Monte Alban, the hilltop metropolis that dominated the region for over 1,000 years and whose ruins remain one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Americas. The Zapotec, at their height, were builders of pyramids and palaces, practitioners of a complex religious system, creators of one of the earliest writing systems in the Western Hemisphere, sophisticated astronomers who oriented their architecture to celestial events, on traders whose networks extended across Mesoamerica, bringing their influence and their goods into contact with cultures separated from them by hundreds of miles. The tomb that was opened in Oaxaca dates to the period archaeologists designate as Monte Alban III, roughly 200 to 700 CE, a period that corresponds to the height of Zapotec political and cultural power, and a period that produced the most elaborate and most informative tombs yet discovered from this civilization. The moment of entry into the tomb was documented by the archaeological team with the methodical care that modern excavation requires, but with an emotional intensity that the published reports and the accounts of the archaeologists themselves make no attempt to conceal. The air that had been sealed inside the tomb for 14 centuries was different from the air outside. Not dramatically, not in ways that created any physical danger for the researchers who entered, but detectably, or in a way that several of the archaeologists present described as the specific sensation of entering a space whose relationship to time was different from the relationship of the surface world to time. The objects arranged within the tomb were coated with the fine dust of 14 centuries, but otherwise intact. The colors of painted surfaces, where paint had been applied to the walls or to objects placed within the tomb, retained a vividness that the centuries had dimmed but not extinguished. The spatial arrangement of the burial goods was exactly as it had been left. Nothing had shifted, nothing had been disturbed by the settling of the earth above, or by the movements of water, or by any of the 1,000 small disruptions that time inflicts on buried objects. The skeletal remains at the center of the tomb were those of a single individual, a determination made quickly from the initial examination and confirmed by subsequent laboratory analysis. The individual was adult, and the specific characteristics of the skeletal remains, combined with the nature and the quantity of the burial goods placed with them, indicated someone of extraordinary social status. High-status Zapotec burials from this period are known from previous excavations. Monte Alban has yielded significant tombs over the decades of archaeological work conducted there. But the completeness and the undisturbed state of this particular tomb made it immediately significant as a source of information that previous discoveries, many of which had been looted before archaeologists could examine them, could not provide. The jade objects were among the first burial goods that the archaeologists cataloged, and their quality and quantity were immediately striking. Jade, specifically jadeite, the hard green stone whose color and rarity made it the most valued material in Mesoamerican cultures, was not a material available from local sources in Oaxaca. The jadeite used in Mesoamerican jade objects came primarily from the Motagua River Valley in what is now Guatemala, hundreds of kilometers from the Zapotec heartland. The presence of jade objects in a Zapotec tomb therefore indicates not just wealth, but connection, access to trade networks that extended across cultural and geographic boundaries and brought prestige materials from distant sources to the valley of Oaxaca. The jade objects in the newly opened tomb included a funerary mask, the most significant single object in the burial, a mosaic of jade pieces assembled into a face that would have covered the features of the deceased, along with jade ear ornaments, jade beads from a necklace that had been arranged across the chest of the deceased, and jade objects of forms that the archaeologists who first examined them described as unlike any previously documented from Zapotec contexts. That last detail, jade objects of forms without clear precedent in the existing Zapotec archaeological record, is one of the findings that has driven the reassessment of what this tomb represents and what its contents mean for the understanding of Zapotec culture and its connections to other Mesoamerican traditions. The Zapotec did not develop in isolation. The Valley of Oaxaca was connected to the broader world of Mesoamerica through trade, through the movement of people, through the transmission of ideas and technologies and artistic conventions across the networks that linked the major centers of pre-Columbian civilization. Teotihuacan, the great city near modern Mexico City, that at its height in the 4th and 5th centuries CE was one of the largest cities in the world, had documented connections to Monte Alban, a neighborhood of Zapotec residents at Teotihuacan, diplomatic exchanges between the two powers, stylistic influences that moved in both directions across the 300 kilometers separating the two centers. The Maya civilization to the south and east maintained its own networks of exchange and influence that reached into Zapotec territory. And the jade objects in the newly opened tomb show stylistic influences that the archaeologists examining them have identified as pointing toward connections that the existing documentation of Zapotec external relationships had not previously established. The ceramic objects in the tomb added another layer to the picture. Zapotec funerary urns, ceramic vessels in the form of figures, both human and divine, that were placed in elite tombs, are among the most recognizable artifacts of this civilization, and the examples found in the newly opened tomb were of exceptional quality and preservation. The figures depicted on the urns are representations of deities or supernatural beings from the Zapotec religious system, a system that has been partially reconstructed from previous archaeological finds and from the colonial era documents that recorded aspects of Zapotec belief before the knowledge was fully lost, but that remains incompletely understood at the level of specific iconographic meanings. Some of the figures on the newly discovered urns bear iconographic elements that match known representations of Zapotec deities. Others display combinations of elements that the specialists who study Zapotec iconography have not encountered in precisely this form in previously documented material, suggesting either that the dacier seed was associated with a specific aspect or manifestation of a deity whose full iconographic range had not previously been documented, or that the religious system of the Zapotec was more regionally varied and locally specific than the existing corpus of material had indicated. The writing found in the tomb represents one of the most significant aspects of the discovery for the reconstruction of Zapotec history. The Zapotec writing system is one of the earliest in the Western Hemisphere. Inscriptions from Monte Alban that date to approximately 500 BCE represent some of the oldest writing yet, documented in Mesoamerica, but it remains only partially deciphered. Unlike Maya hieroglyphics, which scholars have made enormous progress in reading over the past half-century to the point where the majority of surviving Maya inscriptions can now be translated with reasonable confidence, Zapotec writing has resisted complete decipherment. The signs, their phonetic and semantic values, and the rules of their combination are understood well enough to identify certain categories of information, dates in the Zapotec calendrical system, proper names, titles, but not well enough to read Zapotec inscriptions with the fluency that Maya inscriptions now permit. The inscriptions found in the newly opened tomb, on the walls of the tomb chamber on several of the ceramic objects, and on a stone object that the archaeologists identified as a possible commemorative marker, add to the corpus of Zapotec writing in ways that the epigraphers who study this script expect will contribute to the ongoing effort to achieve a more complete decipherment. The biological analysis of the skeletal remains has produced findings that have added a dimension to the tomb's significance that the material objects alone could not have provided. DNA extracted from the remains, a technically demanding process given the age of the material and the conditions of its preservation, but one that the state of modern ancient DNA analysis has made increasingly achievable for material of this period, has been analyzed in ways that provide information about the biological ancestry of the individual buried in the tomb, and their relationship to modern populations descended from the pre-Columbian inhabitants of Oaxaca. The results place the individual firmly within the genetic profile of ancient Zapotec pop. Ulations as established from previously analyzed remains, confirming the archaeological identification of the tomb as Zapotec, and providing a data point that contributes to the growing understanding of genetic continuity and change in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Isotopic analysis of the remains, the examination of chemical signatures in the bones that reflect the geographic origins of the food and water consumed during life, produced a result that was unexpected. The isotopic signature of the remains is not consistent with a lifetime spent in the valley of Oaxaca. It indicates significant time spent in a different geographic region, a region whose isotopic characteristics the laboratory analysis points toward as corresponding to an area considerably to the north or west of the Zapotec heartland. An individual of extraordinary social status, buried in an elaborate tomb in the Zapotec heartland with burial goods showing connections to distant trade networks, whose isotopic signature indicates they did not spend their entire life in Oaxaca. This combination of biological and material evidence is the finding that has most directly driven the description of this discovery as history-shaking. It raises questions whose answers will require years of additional research to develop, but whose implications are already visible in outline. Was this individual born elsewhere and brought to the valley of Oaxaca? Through marriage alliance, through diplomatic exchange, through the movement of elite individuals between polities that maintained relationships of the kind documented elsewhere in Mesoamerica? Did this individual travel extensively during their lifetime, spending significant periods in regions distant from their home community in ways that their elevated social status facilitated? Is the isotopic evidence pointing toward a pattern of elite mobility in Zapotec society that existing historical reconstructions had not accounted for? The question of who specifically is buried in the tomb, whether this individual can be connected to known historical figures from the Zapotec record, whether the inscriptions in the tomb contain a name that can be read and matched to individuals mentioned in other inscriptions from Monte Alban or other Zapotec sites, is one that the epigraphers working on the material are actively pursuing. The Zapotec inscriptions from Monte Alban record names and titles and events in a way that has allowed scholars to begin reconstructing a partial history of Zapotec rulers and significant figures. But the incompleteness of the decipherment and the fragmentary nature of the surviving record mean that connecting a specific burial to a specific historical individual is a difficult task, even when the inscriptional evidence from the tomb itself is relatively abundant. The inscriptions from the newly opened tomb are currently being analyzed with the full toolkit of modern epigraphy. Comparative analysis against the existing corpus of Zapotec writing, computational approaches to pattern recognition in the signs, consultation with the specialists in related Mesoamerican writing systems, whose knowledge of how these scripts function can sometimes illuminate aspects of related systems. The condition of the tomb itself, its architectural construction, its state of preservation, the specific engineering decisions that went into its creation, is a subject of separate study that has produced its own significant findings. Zapotec elite tombs are typically constructed of cut stone, built beneath the floors of significant structures, temples, elite residences, administrative buildings, and sealed with stone slabs. The newly opened tomb follows this general pattern, but shows specific construction details that the architects and engineers working with the archaeological team have identified as indicating a level of technical sophistication in OMB construction that adds to the existing picture of Zapotec building capabilities. The orientation of the tomb, the direction it faces, its relationship to the structure above it and to the surrounding landscape, has been analyzed in relation to the astronomical alignments that are a documented feature of Zapotec sacred architecture. Preliminary analysis suggests that the tomb's orientation incorporates a celestial alignment that would have been astronomically significant at the time of its construction, consistent with the Zapotec practice of embedding astronomical meaning in their architectural decisions, but specific in its details to this particular burial in ways that may reflect the specific identity or role of the individual interred within it. The 1,400 years that the tomb waited beneath the earth of Oaxaca are not simply a measure of how long the contents were preserved, they are a measure of how long the specific individuals who arranged that burial and sealed that tomb have been gone from the world, and how much of what they knew and believed and intended has been lost in their absence. The objects they placed in the tomb were arranged according to a logic that was completely clear to them, and is only partially recoverable by the researchers who examine those objects 2 millennia later. The inscriptions they carved on the walls communicated something to the people who placed them there, communicated it with the confidence of people using a writing system they were fluent in, leaving a message for whatever audience they imagined. And that message is available to modern scholars, only in fragments, through a script that remains incompletely understood. What the archaeologists who opened the tomb found when they broke through the sealed entrance was not just burial goods and skeletal remains. They found the most direct available connection to people who lived and died in Oaxaca 1,400 years ago. People who had names and roles and relationships and beliefs that shaped everything about how they were buried and what was placed with them. The objects tell parts of the story. The bones carry biological information that tells other parts. The inscriptions may eventually yield the specific details that transform an archaeological type. An elite Zapotec burial of the Monte Alban III period into a named individual with a place in the human record. History was shaken not because the tomb contained treasure, though it contained objects of extraordinary beauty and cultural significance. History was shaken because the tomb was intact, because the specific combination of a salient and systematic archaeological response that led to its opening preserved everything exactly as it had been left, and because everything as it had been left is more complex, more connected, more surprising, and more human than the existing historical framework had predicted. The Zapotec built a tomb for someone they considered worthy of extraordinary commemoration. They sealed it. They left. 1,400 years passed. The earth kept what they placed in it. And when the entrance was finally opened and the air of 14 centuries ago met the air of the present, what was waiting inside was not just history, it was a specific person, surrounded by the specific objects that specific people had chosen to place with them in a specific arrangement that encoded a meaning that the world above the tomb had spent 14 centuries forgetting how to read. The work of remembering has begun.